Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary Shirley and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Hi, you're listening to the Great Women in Compliance podcast on the Compliance Podcast Network with Mary Shirley and Lisa Fine. I'm Lisa Fine, and today I'm so excited to speak with Tiffany Archer. This is someone I've been hoping to speak with for a while, and I'm just thrilled that you are here. Tiffany is the Regional Ethics and Compliance Officer and Corporate Counsel for Europe and the Americas at Panasonic Aviation Corporation. Tiffany has spoken and written on many key areas in the ethics and compliance world and is always here to support other members of our community. So as we get started, Tiffany, why don't you tell us a bit about your background and about your path to your current role?
Of course. And you know, first and foremost, thank you so much for having me. I am equally excited to be part of this incredible podcast that I've been following for quite some time. So thank you for extending the opportunity for me to be a guest. Back to your first question, my background and the path to my current role. I don't want to go too far back, but for contextual purposes, I'd really love the chance to share a little bit about my life experiences and kind of how those have shaped and influenced me and my values as a compliance officer. And when I reflect on how I grew up, I realized that I managed a very full plate. In addition to a rigorous academic curriculum, I participated in many, many extracurricular activities. So those of you listening out there, here we go. I was a nationally ranked track athlete. I played the violin in my school orchestra, the clarinet in our marching band, and I also, all at the same time, studied piano and the ballet. And yes, I 100% agree that this was a full plate, but I was determined to be successful in everything I participated in, and it really did become critical for me to figure out how best to strike the correct balance to achieve the success that I was aspiring towards. So I later went on to law school, and then I practiced law in two major firms in Washington, D.C. And while I had a really rigorous work schedule and regularly traveled internationally, I wanted to go for more from an extracurricular perspective. And I decided that I would get involved in fitness competitions. And shortly thereafter, I became a professional fitness competitor. So I was balancing both the rigors of my law firm life and the rigors of, preparing for shows and competitions. And I think when I look back, that's the point where it really all clicked for me. And when I say that, I mean, there are three key values that seem to have been instrumental in helping me achieve balance, right? And to also have success, not only in my personal life, but also in my professional life. And I just kind of wanted to touch on those three key values and how they have an intersection with compliance. And so the first one is discipline. Obviously, this requires the conviction, right, to do something over and over in order to reach your ultimate goal. And with fitness, for me in that lifestyle, it was a multiple gym session a day type of thing, going over and over, managing your food intake, a really regimented lifestyle, and also one where you need to exercise patience because you don't see changes quickly. It really instead happens over time. But through it all, my belief was, and still continues to be, that you have to put in work to really see results, whatever that work may be. And similarly, in compliance, I think it really is a very similar concept. Nothing happens overnight. Much of the process in creating a strong and effective compliance program is about making really good, sound decisions, facing challenging decisions, but really doing that over and over and over again. And this may take the form of multiple efforts at messaging or working with difficult stakeholders who may not see why or the benefit or the value and the change that you're trying to make. But you have to approach it from the view that everything takes time in order for you to see change. And as Jim Rohn says, and he's someone who I think he has some really compelling quotes, is discipline is the bridge, right, between goals and accomplishment. And so my advice to all of you listeners out there as it relates to discipline is set your goals, be disciplined and stick with it, and really seek to accomplish it. Second value, excellence. And so for me, whether it was music or athletics, I approached all activities with the mindset that I'm not here to be mediocre. I'm here for one reason and one reason only, and that's to surpass ordinary standards. I've always wanted to be the best at whatever it is that I set my goals on. And so similarly in compliance, I think the same holds true. We should all strive to be the best at what we do, and we should not stop at mediocrity. And my mantra is, if you don't strive for excellence, you really have nothing to be proud of. And last value is integrity, right? And so it's about doing the right thing, even if it's hard, and doing the right thing, whether anyone is there or not. And if I tie this back to, when I was competing in fitness, I wasn't always being observed when it came to making sure that I was eating the right thing, but I was showing integrity to myself, right? I was doing what I knew was right because I knew what I was trying to achieve. And it didn't matter whether my coach was watching or whether, a peer was watching. I did it because I had set goals and I wanted to accomplish them. And that's exactly what we're looking to impress upon in the realm of compliance when we're dealing with employees or stakeholders or change. We want our stakeholders and we want organizations to uphold the highest integrity, regardless of the challenge that comes with doing so. And honestly, whether or not anyone is looking. And so with that, I've applied these values directly to my career in compliance and really do feel that they've fundamentally helped me as I continue on my professional trajectory to evolve and grow. And so now currently I oversee 2 large regions for Panasonic Avionics, both Europe and the Americas. And discipline, excellence, and integrity have helped us forge ahead as we've looked to enhance our program.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because all of those things, those 3 things are really pillars for wherever you are or whatever, one is doing in their life. It's interesting as you talk about the fitness component of it. People who've listened to this hear that I talk about, taking boxing classes or doing that. One of the things for me that was really became the challenge for it, which is a little different, was knowing I was not going in the ring. Spoiler alert, there are not conveniently defined fights. But also that it was something that I was doing to strengthen myself and do it to be the best version of myself as opposed to the best at it. And, I think that it's really significant to look at these different parts of your life of, how you're going to be the best and how it makes you stronger in your career and also, in living your life on a day-to-day basis, especially for someone like you who's had so many different experiences. I mean, for those who don't know how intense Washington, D.C. and New York law firms can be, that in itself demands, 24/7 excellence in a lot of ways. And you did that. And then the next thing that you did before Panasonic, when you were at Axiom, you had a very different experience because you were seconded to companies. You were a regulatory and compliance attorney. So you were supporting their legal and compliance departments.
Right.
What were the highlights and learnings there? And I mean, there you're coming in, you're being, you're a leader, you're being the best, and you're also a guest with some, special access at the same time.
Sure. And I love that reference, a guest with the special access, and I might coin that. Use that later on in future discussions or dialogues. But yeah, during my time with Axiom, I had some incredible learning experiences that spanned various industries, varying compliance programs. And when I say that, I mean, some of which were in their infancy stages, while others were more developed and the focus was more about refinement and enhancement. And also, I was fortunate to have worked directly with chief compliance officers or CECOs, with different leadership styles. And I think all of those types of exposures have really helped me kind of understand how I would like to be as a leader and how I define and look to develop a program that I think will be successful. One learning for me has been comparing and contrasting each organization, right? And how compliance can be achieved successfully despite what you're presented with. So if you are in a program where it's in its infancy stages, but yet, you're stretched on resources, you still can have success. You need to be resilient, you need to be able to pivot. But, something I learned is that's exactly it. There's no one size fits all approach. There's no one template necessarily that you can apply. you really have to be proactive about getting a lay of the land, understanding how that organization's ecosystem works, and putting all of that together and then figuring out, what are the next best steps. And again, you have to have the ability to pivot, be resilient, and then understand that whatever approach that you've tailored for that organization, will it work? And do you have the buy-in of those stakeholders? It's key to ensure that they too are bought into what you think will be helpful and how that kind of aligns with their business objectives. So that's another thing that I've learned. And in addition, I would say, let's not overlook the importance of forging strong relationships very early on. And some of the listeners might say, okay, why, right? Why aren't I doing more so a risk profile, right? As the DOJ may have mentioned last summer, like that's really important, understanding the company's risk profile, particularly in light of the pandemic. And my view is a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, right? So getting to know the stakeholders and other functions and across the organization, understanding their nuanced or discrete challenges, and also understanding where the intersections with those business functions lie as it relates to compliance will be of great help as you try to build out or enhance a program. In my view, you need to know about those vulnerabilities in the chain early on in order to plan the most effective path forward. And also, I just mentioned a bit about COVID, and I wanted to touch on that here because that's kind of our reality right now, right? And so clearly COVID has drastically changed the ways we interact. Many of us are largely working virtually, and some of us may even be transitioning to new roles in new organizations, or maybe even new roles within their current organizations. And I would say that, regardless of your status, don't let the current circumstances be a deterrent for proactive outreach. Take the time to really reach out to people, set up virtual coffees or virtual rooms where people can all come online and you can get to know people and have some dialogues that have to do with things outside of work. That's a really great way of getting to know people, but also establishing trust. My view, persistence does pay dividends. And I would go as far as to say that in this particular period of time, it's right to apply, the 3 values that I set out earlier in this conversation. Be disciplined about your efforts to obtain more transparency from your stakeholders and to get those lines of communications to open up. I mean, who are we as compliance officers if we're not kind of being read into what those issues are or where risks lie? Also, obtain excellence in our programs, and our efforts should not be thwarted in light of these challenging times. The DOJ has made clear that the pandemic is not preventing them from evaluating and enforcing against organizations who are not upholding effective compliance programs. So this is not the time to sway from aspiring to excellence. I would actually say now more than ever, we should all be striving for excellence. And then lastly, as compliance officers, I would say continue to uphold integrity as a key pillar, right? That's something that underlies pretty much every program. And I think regardless of the pandemic and these unprecedented times, we should really continue to do so.
Yeah. And I do think when you were talking, one of the things to keep in mind as well about having coffees, virtual coffees or Zoom rooms or other things, no matter where you are and what phase you are at an organization, it helps a lot when people know that you actually are concerned about what's going on a day-to-day basis before there's a crisis or before a risk assessment, because then they trust you. And
exactly.
They're willing to share what's going on day to day, and something they may not even think could be a problem. They'll talk about in conversation, and you're able to solve problems proactively. And I do think I think a lot about integrity, because really our work product is our word and our ability to respond to our clients, customers, external agencies. And I think that, when you just hit the nail right on the head about that.
I agree. I mean, it's critical that and I'm actually, as we go through some of these questions, I want to talk a bit more about that, but I absolutely agree that it's critical to get in front of these people from before an issue occurs, develop those relationships and solidify those bonds before an issue occurs, so that they are willing to kind of move forward and talk to you and notify you of any sort of issues before things get so far down the pipeline that it's, a little bit hard to kind of walk it back.
Yep. The act first, apologize later, and hope for the best approach is not always the greatest of them. But I mean, we've all had to live through that once or twice.
Sure.
Then that goes on to the never waste the good crisis, but that's subject for another day. But, one of the things too, though, with all of that, is that how you may interact with somebody in the U.S. versus in Europe or other regional things. You've also talked a lot in the past about addressing cultural differences. I know you referenced Erin Meyer's The Culture Map. If you have a practical tip on how to communicate with all these different, stakeholders or individuals, formally or informally, what would that be to you?
That's a great question. I mean, first and foremost, this is like kind of a softball one, but if it isn't already, this book should absolutely be part of your compliance library. I've relied on it on a number of occasions. As I mentioned earlier, I've pretty much sustained an international practice from when I started practicing in this field. And I've worked with stakeholders all over the world. And it's so incredibly important, in my opinion, to be able to find that fine line balance between embracing and appreciating culture and then creating an effective program that actually takes into account cultural norms so that you're able to encourage positive behavior that those cultural individuals feel like do take into account, what their challenges are and do make them feel as if you were listening, right? When you were talking with them about what it is that they're facing and how things really operate in their jurisdiction, because it's not all the same. As I said earlier, there isn't a one size fits all approach or template that can be applied. And there's so much value in Erin's book. And she has quite a few diagrams and metrics and things that you can use to really plot out the way that you speak with your stakeholders and really take a targeted approach that feels mindful and personal. And also I wanted to say, interestingly, we're talking about addressing cultural differences, but I like to believe that despite those differences, there is a common thread, right, that runs through developing a sound ethical culture in a particular organization. And so to use a simple example, I often compare building an ethical culture to constructing a house, right? You need a strong foundation to ensure the integrity of the structure. And then additional key foundational pillars, which frankly, I think are often overlooked, are empathy and emotional intelligence. And back to your point, Lisa, earlier, these really help to open up doors to building trust, eliciting candor, honesty, and having that open line of communication, which again is key to success as a compliance officer. And so for me, connecting on a personal level, you mentioned this too, before focusing on compliance related issues is really critical, right? Because that's when people feel you're invested in them and you're invested in what affects them. And that's when those bonds really start to forge and develop. And there's something to be said, right, about putting yourself in someone else's shoes and then connecting with them on a deeper level and even resolving conflicting viewpoints without tension or resistance. I mean, this shows them that you get it, right? You understand them and you can come and meet in the middle despite having potentially different perspectives or views. And I think that will then pretty much ensure that they will be more likely to come to you to resolve an ethical dilemma and also will encourage them to act with integrity instead of sweeping a potential issue under the rug. And so, once I get to that point where I feel like that connection is strong and I feel that that confidence level has evolved as it relates to trust, that's when I feel that quote house that I mentioned earlier, that the house that I attempted to construct is sound.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great analogy. Ever since you gave that one to me at some point in time a couple of months ago, I have to confess I've stolen that one. If you're taking special access, I think I'm taking the house. But it really is. I mean, and I think the way that you were just speaking about ethical decision making, it's an important pivot for us in compliance when you think about it as ethics and compliance, because when people realize you're trying to help them make tough choices as opposed to a right and wrong definition, I think that helps build the same relationships you're talking about. And culturally, the way things are implemented may be different, but the view of trying to do the right thing pretty rarely is.
Right.
So, yeah. And I mean, one thing you mentioned earlier as you were talking about coronavirus, and I wanted to go back to that, and also something that you've been talking about recently, is that you've spoken about diversity and inclusivity during this virus, part of the Women in Law Summit. But generally, over the last year, if I think of 2020 and all of its uniqueness, there are two big things to me, obviously COVID, and then the Black Lives Matter and social justice movement. I mean, I think they're critical to all of us. And what do you think that ethics and compliance role should be in promoting the diversity, equality, and inclusion in organizations?
I mean, this is a simple one in my view. I think we need the organizations or organizations generally to walk the walk and talk the talk, right? And who better to be on the front lines than the compliance function? And some may argue why, like why compliance, why not some other function or a dedicated function to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And for me, I think, the compliance function, who are we really fundamentally? If you strip away all of the other things, the ones who reinforce regulatory requirements or the ones who are, quote, the Department of No. I mean, ultimately, the compliance function, we're ambassadors, right, who should be actively modeling behaviors that are aligned with our organization's culture. And so we're responsible for holding employees accountable if they fail to uphold underlying pillars of the organization's values. And so in my view, if an organization is truly, truly serious, right, about improving their culture and amplifying the importance of a diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment, I believe they should partner with compliance in an effort to move the needle in this space. I don't know, Lisa, or those who are listening, if you've heard of Edward Hall's cultural iceberg model, but strongly suggest you look it up if you haven't. But just quickly, to add a little color here, under Hall's theory, he says that just like an iceberg, part of a culture is visible and readily obvious, right? So those are the things that are quick wins, we can readily fix, easy to address because, they're out in the open. But it's the larger portion of a culture below the surface, in the depths, of that iceberg. That's where we really need to spend more time, right? Because that's where things like employee values, their thought patterns, their biases, all of those things, that's where they lie. And so it's this meaningful behavioral data and metrics that I think will allow organizations to actually effectuate change. And so, there's no disputing it that there will inevitably be challenging conversations amongst employees and leadership and difficult issues to navigate. But I think, we really do need to spend the time digging into what lies below the tip of the iceberg to effectively make the changes that we want to see. And I think the ethics and compliance function is the perfect partner to help to undertake that task.
Yeah. I mean, I this is something I think about a lot, and it's something we've talked about on the podcast. And Mary, we have an ongoing discussion and dialogue about social justice and Black Lives Matter, which we continue. We have had a series, but now we also, it's an ongoing thing. It's not every week, but it's a part of all of our discussions and thoughts. And the reason I wanted to mention that also is that, how would you talk about actively committing to diversity and inclusion and, advice to we mostly have women listening to but women and men that are in this audience. And how do we best promote this values and be allies to people of color, other minorities? Because, globally, there are many different concerns that we all have to keep in mind. What's your thought on that?
Sure. I mean, I think my biggest advice is jump in and get involved, right? Look to see what your organization is doing internally. In light of some of the events that happened last year, Black Lives Matter, social justice movements, we've seen a lot of change in this space. Organizations are hiring diversity inclusion officers or, other like roles that focus specifically on these types of issues. We've seen kind of the evolution of task forces that have been dedicated to kind of working towards bringing more visibility to and coming up with proactive initiatives to address concerns around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Working groups also, and also the engagement of third-party consultants, right, who are engaged to come in, assess company policies, practices, pipelines, and procedures. And at my organization, specifically at Panasonic, we have a fantastic chief culture officer named Heather Kopitich, who she has a key role in working with others in our organization and our parent organization, as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So first and foremost, I would say, get out there, see what's happening, and see how you can, proactively offer your services and time to help the organization kind of ramp up as it relates to addressing these very important and current concerns. I would also advocate for proactive outreach to peers who may be able to let you know about external opportunities. Not only can there be helpful opportunities in your organization, but there are a lot of organizations who are soliciting help from those who may not, externally. And so I would say that get involved in that way too. Through my network, I had the opportunity to become an advisory board member for an organization dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm also part of a couple of D&I working groups that are not connected to my organization. So again, I would say, if this is an issue that's important to you and you're looking to promote these values and to be an ally and to help people of color and other minorities, I would strongly encourage you to, look both internally and externally and see where, you can make the strongest impact and contributions.
Yeah, I think those are all great ideas and, good places to start and to continue. And I think that as you've talked about all those, and you've talked about things that you're doing, just a minute ago, talking about different groups that you're involved in, and you touched on this throughout. You particularly seem to bring the pillars that you talk about, discipline, excellence, and integrity, to everything you do, and that includes how ethics and compliance. It's not just a career for you or for many of us, but it's really a passion. At the same time, there's this idea of work-life balance that everybody sees very differently. And one of the things that's kind of also your extracurricular and one of your hobbies as well is writing and speaking. And it enhances your work. How do you balance doing that as something that's kind of, quote, for fun and for passion, as much as balancing it with the amount of, day-to-day work and tasks that need to get done for you to be as successful as you are in your current role?
Thank you for asking that. I really am excited about this particular extracurricular activity. I've always been passionate about ethics and compliance, generally speaking. And for those who may not know, I studied psychology in college, and I really do try to keep my finger on the pulse on new and current theories, not only in psychology but also as it relates to behavioral science and organizational behavioral theories. And so quick shout out to Dan Ariely. I think he has some really incredible literature out there that has certainly served me well in some of the work that I've been doing or have done. And in my view, to succeed in this space, you have to demonstrate empathy, and you have to understand individuals' motivations, beliefs, and triggers so you can get ahead of misconduct. And so for me, once the pandemic hit, I became even more proactive about reaching out to folks online who I may not even know, but I found their profiles interesting, or the work that they had done or are doing interesting, or maybe I had heard them on a podcast or a panel and wanted to learn more from their perspective. And what I've come to find is that the compliance community is so incredibly welcoming, informative, open to sharing ideas, collaborative. And I'm so happy to have had the opportunity to contribute. And so in addition to my work obligations, to maintain balance, I just make it an effort to carve out time, really plan, what it is that I'm looking to do versus what it is that I'm responsible for from a professional perspective, my work responsibilities. and carve out time to stay involved and contribute thought leadership as often as possible. Because I believe that, compliance does not stop once you leave your office. And I think that's, in part why I'm so passionate about it, because there's so much that as compliance officers, we can continue to do even when we leave our, organizational programs. I think compliance is a mindset and, and it's a value. And I believe that through my values of discipline, excellence, and integrity, I'll continue to maintain this balance and continue to have opportunities to engage with like-minded people like you, Lisa, and others.
I'll take it.
And share ideas and develop strong bonds. So that's something that's really important to me. I really do like the fact that I can kind of compartmentalize what I do for my organization versus, how I continue to try to remain relevant and have connections and continue to learn from others, outside of my professional context. So that's kind of how I seek to achieve that balance.
Well, you're doing a great job on it, because sometimes I don't know how you do all the things that you do. And, I thank you so much for sharing, your wisdom, your insight with all of us, and, how all of the things that you've done with your pillars and your values. And I think that they're ones that we can all share. So on behalf of Mary and of me, thank you, Tiffany, so much for being here with us on the Compliance Podcast Network. And I know that a lot of our audience is in the United States, and it is a rough time here. So I want everybody to take care of themselves, stay safe, and you do the same, Tiffany. And thanks so much to all.
Thank you so much for having me. And I echo Lisa's sentiments. Everyone stay safe, stay healthy, and, we will get to the other side. So hang in there.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.